Well, hey, Dean.
Hi, Mickey.
The podcast. I'm excited to have you on because you were my master's advisor. You've been my mentor. I tell everybody I see you're the reason that I got into biometrics. I mean, without you, it wouldn't have been possible. Although I have to say, and I think I've said in the past, you tricked me a little bit because I thought I was just going to be in the woods all the time. And that's not happened since I left Stephen F. Austin.
I got tricked too. I thought the same thing. And this career, once they figure out you can crunch numbers and everything, they put you in the office a lot.
Yeah, right. Well, so you have had big major career shifts, and now you're, working for BTG Pactual, who owns timberlands across, at least North and South America, as far as I know. Prior to that, you were, a professor, and prior to that, you worked in industry. And so you've kind of worn a bunch of different hats. So for me, I think that was great having you as a mentor, because I realized you don't just have to do one thing. There's lots of opportunities out there. But I'm curious. I've known, bits and pieces of your whole story, but I'm excited to get to hear the whole thing. So can you tell me, how did it happen? How did you get interested in forestry? Where did it start? The origin story, as Greg Johnson says.
The origin story. It's pretty clear for me when that happened. It was Boy Scouts is the reason I chose a career in natural resource management. Of course, and it happened at Philmont Scout Ranch. And literally our troop, we were sitting in a meadow for a break along our trek. And we were just commenting like, man, this is the life. This would be great. How can you do this forever? And one of the older boys, because they were, starting to look for colleges and stuff, said, you need to be a forestry major. And it's like, where do you do that in Texas? And you go to Stephen F. Austin. And so the rest is history, as you might say. I was pretty single-minded. I didn't really know what a forester did. That's what I came to learn, when I went to school, about how many different directions you could go. But it really all started with Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout.
Yeah, there's so many biometricians that started out as Eagle Scouts. I just, from doing this podcast and talking to people about doing the podcast, realized like I'm one of the odd men out that I was not a Boy Scout. And, my hometown, Chirino, it's because it was so small. We just didn't have the opportunity to join the Scouts.
Right.
There was no scout troops, at least not at that time. But
you were living in the East Texas piney woods, so that was one place that we frequented a lot, and I just fell in love with it.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I grew up there, and my family were involved in the logging industry, not necessarily forestry, but in logging, and that's basically how I got into it. But it's nice to see the different paths.
That's interesting you said that, because maybe I should add one more thing to the origin story. The Philmont experience was huge, certainly. But when I reflect a little bit more, before Boy Scouts was Webelos and Cub Scouts. And I actually got started in Webelos. And the den that we were in, it was a mother and father kind of, sort of a tag team with us boys. And the father had like his hobby, his passion was woodworking, and the whole garage at their woodworking shop. And we just built stuff, bluebird boxes, little benches, different kinds of things that he had us all doing. And, that probably had a pretty big impact too, just working with wood, because it was a really positive experience as well. So maybe that was the precursor, and then we did a lot of camping once we got to the Boy Scout level, and those things together probably built up and added to it. Plus, my family was a farming family, not forestry, because it was Northeast Texas, but dairy, cattle, and so just, a love for the outdoors, I think was pretty early on in my life and constant through my teenage years.
Yeah. That's exciting that you at least had some, outlet to go and experience the woods. I guess that's what's great about the Boy Scouts is that it gets people that might not otherwise have been able to do those kinds of things. That gives them the outlet to do that. So that's great.
Yeah, I think so. My family wasn't really a camping family, so certainly that's where I got that experience.
Yeah. So when you decided to go to forestry schools, you said in East Texas, you go to SFA, or most of Texas, you go to SFA. What did you think when you got there? What were your aspirations? What were you wanting to do? Because I assume it wasn't biometrics.
I didn't even know anything like that existed. I will add, one of my best friends in high school he wanted to be a veterinarian, so he was going to Texas A&M. And Texas A&M at the time did have a forestry program, SAF accredited program. So you actually did have a choice of where you could go, but it made sense to me to go to Stephen F. Austin simply because you're in the piney woods. And whereas, I don't, do they call that the cross timbers? I don't know really what that region of Texas is where Bryan College Station is located, but it's more like post oak savanna type landscape. So I really wanted to be, again, back to the Boy Scout experience and having hiked in the National Forest of East Texas and camped there. That's where I wanted to be. So when I got to Stephen F. Austin, I think when I arrived, again, because of the influences that I had, I basically wanted to be an outdoor trek leader. I wanted to take people on hiking trips and camping trips. And so I guess maybe I gravitated initially towards recreation. There was the Forestry 111, right? The Introduction to Forestry, which is designed to just show incoming students all the different things you could do. And that really opened up my mind quite a bit as to how large the umbrella is in forestry. And my grandfather was a math professor at UT Arlington. And so, numbers, and I was really close to him. And he obviously made me like and appreciate math. And he was a huge influence on my life in that regard. So once we got to the last cruising timber, I took a liking to that because of the numerical calculations that were involved and everything. But I wouldn't say that I realized that, hey, I can be a biometrician. I didn't even know what that word meant. In fact, in those days, I think we used the word mensuration was the first word I heard in that regard. But it wasn't really until David Lenhart's, in those days, I think they called it Forest Mensuration 2 was, I think, the name of it. I'm kind of slept since then, but I think that was the name of it. Or Forest Measurements 2. It could have been one or the other, but I'd had Ellis Hunt's class, which was the first one. And I loved him as a professor. I loved the class. I really struggled with it at first. That was sort of my first introduction to statistics and the whole idea of frequency distributions and variances and things like that. It just was not clicking with me. And then all of a sudden this big bright light came on, and that was a great experience. And then, like I said, it was Lenhart's class, and then we went to Field Station and did the cruising. And I think that's where I really solidified into, this is the career path that I want to go. So by my senior year, at that time, we didn't have management plans like you did as a separate class. It was integrated into the Field Station experience. Mm-hmm. But, after Field Station, and at that time, Field Station was a junior year experience, right? It was the summer after you completed your junior year.
Okay.
So your senior year, was a lot different back then. I was an 82 to 86 at Stephen F. Austin, timber management major. And during my senior year, I pretty much decided that's the direction I wanted to go. So I applied to a lot of different graduate schools, and the only one that accepted me was the University of Washington. So, off to the Pacific Northwest I went.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Being able to go directly from Stephen F. Austin, you've been basically in Texas your whole life, and then go out to the Pacific Northwest and get that experience.
It was culture shock.
Yeah.
It was actually more, it wasn't culture shock, but more than anything, it was a climate shock, because you go from East Texas, with our thunderstorms and tornadoes and hurricanes and hot weather and humidity and all that, to basically there's rain and drizzle and cool temperatures in August. That was like the big shocker for me.
Yeah.
Was actually the first year I was there, it was really depressed because it just rained all the time. It was cloudy all the time. But then I guess I got web between my fingers and, liked all the different shades of green. And now to this day, if it doesn't rain for a long spell, I actually start getting, a little antsy about it. It's like, oh, we need some rain. We need some rain. So
Right.
I grew to love it. I love the Pacific Northwest. It's a beautiful, amazing forestry region.
Yeah. And, I think whenever I was, starting my master's with you, you recommended that if I was going to do a second degree, I could do it in the same institution, but the third degree, I needed to move on and get experience elsewhere. And which, of course, I kind of stayed in the South because I went to Virginia Tech. But what I'm missing from my experience is that Pacific Northwest experience that you had. Like, I didn't go out there and, not just climate wise, timber wise, but different kinds of modeling systems, in place, because
Yeah, it's really different.
you might have 3 or 4 or 5 different products on one tree, and it's a lot different than here.
Yeah, it really is. There's the multi-product cruising and just totally different systems. More of an individual tree approach to modeling. Of course, Al Stage, in his work had a Dave, Han, right? Dave Han at Oregon State when he was there. Those guys were. And then in California, all of the places were definitely in the West driven by individual tree models. And of course, David Linhart, having been, one of Jerry Clutter's graduate students and office mates with Harold Burkhart,
Mm-hmm.
we had like a good dose of Southern growth and yield. But in those undergraduate classes, we didn't really build those models, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, we used them for class exercises and, for some of the labs, like where we did have to write management plans and do growth projections. But as an undergraduate, I never really got to see how those were built. And Linhart was definitely a mentor for me and a huge influence. He wanted me to stay at Stephen F. Austin, but I guess I should add that as an undergraduate, I had an internship in Colorado with the Bureau of Land Management, actually 2 internships, one at Grand Junction, Colorado, and the other one in Glenwood Springs. And both of those supervisors they were really great people. I really appreciated them. Jim Byers and Mike Hicks. I haven't really kept up with them over the years, but they were influential in getting me interested in the Pacific Northwest because they had worked in Oregon and Washington during their careers. And they said it was a good idea to expose yourself to, different regions, where forestry is practiced. And they highly recommended the Pacific Northwest. Mm-hmm. So I would credit those 2 guys for getting me to apply, to Washington. And I don't remember where else I applied to out there. I don't remember. But Washington is the one that accepted me, and so that's where I went.
So what did you do in your master's work in Washington?
It was high growth of young true fur, mostly Pacific silver fur, but also there was I had noble fur data that I collected too. It was a Bob Curtis project. It was a 1-year project that was designed to, in those days, they had some height growth and side index curves for true fur, but the data set that they had started at like 40 years old. So what Bob wanted to do was to collect less than 40-year-old data to kind of nail down that end of the curve. And so it was a 1-year project focused on that, the early height growth of Pacific silver fur and noble fur. And it was perfect because I didn't have any kind of a fellowship or a scholarship, and I was out of state. So because I didn't have an assistantship, I was having to pay out of state tuition, and I was doing it myself. I didn't have any student loans, and I was basically out of money. Everything that I'd saved in those days, you could actually work for a summer and save up enough money to, pay your tuition for the year and still have some left over, unless you're an out-of-state student. And then I was pretty much drained out. I didn't have any money. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And my major professor at Washington was Doug McGuire, which was, he kind of bounced between coasts too. And he was a brand new professor just out of Oregon State University, and a really great mentor for me. I have highest praise for Doug. And he kind of knew what my situation was. And I remember him calling me into his office and said, "I got a deal for you." And so sure enough, it was this great 1-year long assistantship with the Pacific Northwest Forest Experiment Station, Bob Curtis out of Olympia. That's where their offices were located. And I worked in the field with Marshall Murray. And those two guys, Bob Curtis and Marshall Murray, were just fantastic people to learn from and work with. Really, really liked them. And so I got it done in a year. So, I did my master's degree in 2 years, and that's what I wanted to do. And then I wanted to go into industry as a forest. By that time, I knew what the word biometrician was.
Yeah.
Wanted to be a forest biometrician in industry. Another real influential thing at University of Washington, I got a lot to say about, the quality of that education. But one thing that was really influential is that they sponsored this growth and yield seminar for, I don't remember which spring it was of I think it was my second year, but they got us graduate students to, each guest that came in and visited, we were assigned to, help them out, drive them around like a chauffeur, get things for them and all that. And the person that I was assigned to was Leon Pinar.
Wow.
And he was a character. He was great. And he was just telling me, I can't even process all the stuff he was telling me, but he was just like a lightning rod of excitement and activity. And it just made me really excited about, the direction I was going with my career. So that was kind of an influential moment as well. And that's where I met Dave Hine, by the way, too. And we found out we had Stephen F. Austin in common. That was pretty cool.
And Boy Scouts.
And Boy Scouts, yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He was telling the story of how he had no idea where Texas even was. And Larry Walker came to led a troop, up to South Dakota. And, Dave was guiding up there, right after high school. And that's how he, got acquainted with Larry Walker. And Larry Walker was like, "Man, you need to come down to Texas and go to SFA forestry school." And He said like a month later he was there. So
yeah, Larry Walker was amazing. I mean, he was a Presbyterian minister, preacher, right? And he had the same fervor of evangelism for recruiting forestry students as, as a preacher to his flock. So he was really quite charismatic in that regard.
yeah.
And I had Larry Walker for 2 of my classes, and it was just, he was very charismatic and just a really neat guy, just amazing amount of energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah. And what about your sampling your cruise techniques? I'm sure you learned something additional there compared to what you were doing in Southeast Texas.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. I got to credit Ellis Hunt. Because I remember, he gave us this weird instrument called a Spiegel Realiscope, and it was like, what is this thing? And it's so much harder to use than a prism. And I remember Ellis Hunt in class saying, "You have no idea where you're going to end up getting your job, and you need to be prepared to cruise timber anywhere in the country." I remember him saying that, but then I got to, I didn't know at that time in a 200 level class, I had no idea I was going to end up in Washington State. And I remember when I got up there and I don't remember who it was, but basically they handed me a reliscope and I just went to work, right?
Yeah.
I knew how to use the bars and everything. Like I said, I don't remember if it was another grad student or a professor or who did that, but they told me later that they kind of did that as a joke, right? Because they knew I was from Texas and they thought I was going to, have no idea what to do. And he said he was shocked that I knew how to use this reliscope. And he said, "Who taught you how to do this?" I said, "Ellis Hunt taught me how to do that because he said you don't know where you're going to work in the country." And so, yeah, you're on slopes, so you're dealing with slope correction. And I know there's some steep places in East Texas, but it's really not that big a deal in the South, or at least my experience in East Texas. I mean, certainly, I guess if you got to North Carolina or Arkansas or somewhere in the Ozarks or whatever, but I'd never worked in any of those places. But it was steep and brushy. The vine maple and all that stuff, that you had to deal with. So the reliscopes, and then again, Ellis Hunt really taught us, he taught us how to use V-bars and things like that. I mean, we never used them in East Texas, but he taught us how to do it. And so you get up there, and that was really common in the Pacific Northwest. Now, one thing that I don't remember if Ellis taught us in 205, because it was really new to me when I got up there. They called it the tariff system. And I can't remember off the top of my head the guy that came up with those. He worked for the state DNR in Washington. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I actually met him. Really nice guy. Really thought outside the box. That's one thing I really remember about him. But, when I first saw that word tariff system, I thought, tariffs and, embargoes and, things like that. But apparently it was something that came from Great Britain, possibly, I think was a technique that they used there. Yeah. And it was basically like a series of local volume equations. And your cruise data would calculate the tariff number that would put you into the right local volume tables. That's the best way I can remember how to describe it. I haven't used it in years, but it was a really slick system to kind of, we all recognize that taper differs by location, right? I mean, you have your diameter and your height, but then, the shape of the tree is important as well. And we know can be very localized. And that's essentially what that system was trying to capture. So, it was something that I used after I learned about it during my master's degree, then used it extensively, when I got out of my master's program, and I did go into industry as like an inventory forester in some different capacities. But then, once I left the Cascades, so to speak, that tariff system just seemed to be only for that area. I don't even know if they use it anymore, if it's still popular.
I don't know. I don't think I've ever heard of it. But it's interesting you say that. And I guess it makes sense whenever you don't have, computing power and that, and especially, I often equate things to, what I know about my time in the Southeast or my time in Norway, where the trees are, a lot shorter and taper doesn't matter quite as much as it does in the Pacific Northwest. Obviously it matters, but not as much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the idea of a, 40-foot log and 20-foot logs and things like that was just mind-boggling to a young forester from East Texas.
Yeah. I interviewed Kim Isles, and he was talking about Grosenbaugh was like, trying to get him to understand a thing that he was like, measuring taper. You only need to measure the, the diameter for like the bottom 1/3 of the tree. And Grosenbaugh was telling him like, look, you just gotta reach up and measure it, and Kim was like, well, not in my part of the world.
Exactly. Oh boy.
I'm probably getting that story wrong, but it was something like that. It was funny.
Yeah, what a great guy Kim Isles too.
Yeah. He sent me copies of his textbooks, and I've been just going through it. It's like so different from like the forestry textbooks that we're used to in the Southeast, the Avery and Burkhardt, and the which when we used Harry Wyant Jr.'s book in your class.
Yeah.
Which is still a great. I have it. I refer to it all the time because it's got all the formulas there, and it's not too big. It's not too thick. It was a great book.
And it wasn't as expensive.
Right.
That was the other thing, is textbooks were just getting so expensive. And as the different editions of those came out, they were adding more, things in them, to be more comprehensive. But really the mensuration part of it wasn't really changing that much.
Right.
And, Harry just kind of boiled his down to, this is what the basics that you need to know. So
yeah, it's interesting how we pretty much figured out how to, measure trees and stands, 75 years ago, and not much has changed since then. We're trying to do it better with drones and sensors and those sorts of things, but it's the methods are still the same.
Yeah, I know we're talking about history and everything, but I probably the biggest and some of the most exciting changes I'm seeing is with technology in the woods. I mean, we're still measuring, the basic type things, but the way we're doing it, I think, is going to become more efficient. And I think one of the things that has me excited about robotics and things like that, with these backpack, under the canopy type systems, is that it frees up the forester from kind of the repetitive measurements, like heights and diameters that are very repetitive. And the forester's freed up to where they can look around and, check out defect and, stoppers and, things like that, maybe the robotics isn't that advanced to, see a fusiform gall, at 12 feet, or a fork at, 35 feet or something like that, because it's in the canopy. Yeah. And so it's, the technology, that's like one of the biggest changes that I think is going to, free up the forester to be more of a forester. Not that cruisers aren't foresters, but if you take them away from all those repetitive measurements, to where, one thing I learned early on is our observational skills, with our training is really, one of the best things, about putting us in the woods.
Right.
That we can free up the repetitive from the repetitive and, focus on those things. That I think is real exciting.
Right. Measuring diameter at breast height is not complicated unless you're short like me and it's up here. But
or if you get to the Pacific Northwest and your trees are 6 foot diameter and they're on a 40% slope, and 4.5 feet is, no problem. But on the downhill side, it's 20 feet above you. Doesn't matter how tall or short you are, you can't do it easily.
But like you said, the forester part of it, the calling of products, the knowing the species, like looking for defects, that's something that is going to be difficult to automate, right? I think, and we've already seen that that's the process. And I can't imagine, that with the current technology that it would work well in very high quality hardwood trees, for example, that are 3 or 4.
That's a really good point. Yeah. I guess, and then in my current role with BTG, that where we are using more of this technology in our inventory is really dominated by southern pine. I mean, it's really hard to. I mean, the diameters certainly, but then you get more outer roundness with hardwood trees. Mm-hmm. And so depending on what, direction you're looking into that tree, it could be, not a circular tree. And so it could be inaccurate. So it has a long ways to go to really find application in, oak, hickory, and maybe something like sweet gum and yellow poplar that does tend to keep more towards a circular shape. It might work better, but I don't have a lot of experience with it in hardwood forest.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get too far away. So we had you at the University of Washington. You were learning a lot. I just wanted to add another anecdote about your reloscope story. So you told that to our class, whenever I was taking mensuration with you in 2004.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
I feel
old. You told us that story and you're like, this is why you need to learn the Spiegel reloscope. And so we learned it and we used it, and I used it when I went to Virginia. And so I thought, this is great. When I got to Norway, everything is a slope, everything is a slope. So I'm like, man, I've got this. Pass me a reloscope. And I get out to the woods by myself, and this reloscope is in metric, and I don't know what
I knew you were going to say. Yeah, I didn't teach metric, and neither did Mr. Hunt. Honestly, I wish we would have converted to the metric system a long time ago. It's so much better, but you're right. Oh boy.
Fortunately, I had done all of my PhD work in metric, so I knew what the rough equivalent was. I could do the calculations to get there, but it was first of all, whoa, these aren't even the same widths apart, they're different. And it was, it took me a minute, but it would have took a lot longer if I hadn't had that experience in your class with the one that we used there. So,
yeah.
So I appreciate passing on the torch of, hey, you need to learn a reloscope.
Yeah, it's, I hope it's still happening, because you could end up anywhere, just like you went to Virginia, then you had no idea you were going to end up in Norway. And that may be, one of the most important things, a young person starting their career, which really, your career starts when you start forestry school. It doesn't start when you get out of forestry school. And you have no idea where you're going to end up, because really, to get started, you have to be flexible. You have to go where the opportunities are. And of course, as you get more experience, then you can start, picking and choosing more. But when you're first starting out, you got to be ready for everything and anywhere.
Which, of course, many of us have seen as we've moved on outside of Stephen F. Austin. So you finished up your master's in 2 years. And then you went to work in, was it in Washington or in Oregon that you went to work at?
It was both. The first job that I had out of school was with a contract cruising company.
Mhm.
Can you hear that like knocking sound?
I
I hope
can.
that, huh? There's like a woodpecker going to work on the side of our house, which I guess fits with the forestry interview, right?
Yeah.
But it was a contractor that had I think they were called Forest Service stand exams,
Mhm.
and it was in the East Cascades, and this was 1988. So I finished up at the University of Washington in '88, and you may remember, I know it's old history now, but those were the really bad Yellowstone fires in
Oh,
1988. And so on the east side of the Cascades, all of those Forest Service employees were getting deployed down to Yellowstone and to deal with those fires. And it left the staffing at low levels in these national forests. So they started shutting us down
mhm.
because, even just pulling your car, your truck off into the grass, the mufflers could, ignite a grass fire. And then everything was so dry and, um, susceptible to, flames, they
Mhm.
just closed the forest. So then that we got moved down to Oregon, Central Oregon, and they weren't, I don't think they called them stand exams. I believe that contract was like an old growth survey. And that was probably the coolest cruising job I've ever had in my entire career,
Yeah.
because it was all about mapping out and quantifying what remaining old growth was left on. Is that the Willamette National Forest? Like Blue River, Oregon. Yeah, you're making me think about things I haven't thought about in a long time. But the trees were gigantic, they were huge, and we were at high elevation and low elevation, and um, all over the place. And so it was just almost like a surreal experience being in some of those old growth forests. And that was my first job. And then it was a seasonal job, right? So by the time November set in and all that, everything was winding down. And so I went back to Texas and hung out there. And I was planning on coming back and working for the same contractor. And the University of Washington, Doug McGuire again, back to Doug, they needed a teaching assistant for. They're on the quarter system
Mhm.
at that time. I don't know if they still are, but they called it spring camp. So it was the spring quarter, and that was their field station. And they had their own forest and facilities and lodging and kitchen, and really cool place. And so I taught out there for that quarter, and that's where I guess Kelsey Milner was calling around to different forestry faculty, and he got hold of Doug McGuire, and Doug McGuire put me in touch with Kelsey, who was the biometrician for Champion International, which, as you know, doesn't exist anymore. But I went to work for Kelsey as an inventory forester. So that would have been the second season out of graduate school.
Mhm.
So the 88, 89 was with the contractor cruising the Forest Service properties, and then Champion International would have been 89, and I stayed with them as a I don't I was hourly, so I don't think I had an official job title,
Mhm.
but I basically worked in the inventory group,
Yeah.
and they had us moving around all over the place. So we were down in Oregon, we were in Northern California for a little bit at that time. Champion owned property around Shasta, and then that's what got me to Montana. Eventually, like you were saying, you got tricked. Well, I got tricked too, and I remember Kelsey telling me that, that you have a master's degree in forest biometrics. We need you inside crunching numbers more than we need you outside counting trees.
Yeah.
So that's what got me to Missoula, Montana. The office specifically was in Milltown, Montana, which was just outside. I mean, talking just a couple miles basically, but that's where their big mill facility was. They had a big stud mill there that they had just built. It was gigantic. And that's where the Champions Western Region headquarters was located. And then they had all their different district offices in California, Washington, and Oregon. But I got transferred to the main headquarters office in Milltown, Montana, and then worked there for a couple of years.
Yeah. And then so you went there and started crunching numbers, and then how did you decide to go for a PhD?
Yeah, I got tricked into that too. Kind of talking about tricks. So I really, I guess what happened was Champion was selling off everything. They were selling off their Western lands because I don't really know what the reasoning was. I was an hourly inventory forester, so I didn't really circulate in those upper circles of decision making and what would have been their reasoning. The best I could tell is that they really thought that it was overcut and that it wasn't growing back that fast, and so they had these big gaps that they weren't going to have any revenue, to feed their mills and everything, which I didn't think it was true, just based on where I had been in the woods. I really thought that the site productivity was underestimated. I really figured it was growing faster than what they thought it was. But anyways, bigger decision makers than me. And so basically I was going to get laid off. I mean, they were closing down their Western operations and, pulling more and more into their Southern paper production, as their core areas. And because I was a hourly employee, the opportunities in the South were going to their salaried employees. At that time, Champion had a lot of property in East Texas, so I was really excited that I might get to move back home.
Yeah.
And I mean, as much as I love the Pacific Northwest, I wanted, we have a really close family and all that. So I wanted to move back closer to home, but there just weren't any opportunities. Kelsey Milner, who I mentioned before, hired me at Champion. By that time, the writing was on the wall for him too. So there was a growth and yield professorship that had just opened up at University of Montana in Missoula. And so he had successfully applied and got that faculty position. And so when I was getting laid off, he was the director of the Inland Northwest Growth and Yield Cooperative, INGI. He said, "Dean, come to work with me, and you can work on your PhD." I said, "Kelsey, I don't want to go back to school. I want to keep working in industry." And he said, "No, this is industry. It's a co-op. You can be a biometrician here, and you can work on the different research projects and crunch the numbers. And we have some really interesting new modeling initiatives." He was really interested in applying physiological growth models to traditional, forest inventory data, but actually being driven by climatic variables and so forth. And I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. It's growth and yield, so that'll be fun. So I did that, and here's where he tricked me. How did I get into a PhD program? Well, he said he needed a TA for the labs. So he said, "I need a TA. I need somebody to run the labs and teach forestry students. It's just like the class that you did for Ellis Hunt, but basically you'll get to run all the labs." And I thought, okay, because he really needed help, or so he thought, or so I thought. And really what I found out is, when he didn't realize he was successful in directly recruiting me as a PhD student, that he basically put me in a teaching position doing field forestry. And I just thought, this is so cool. You know, how do you do that? And he's like, well, that's funny. You should ask. You know, if you want to be, you know, a forestry professor, you got to get a PhD. And also our funding, you know, for this project with INGI is starting to run out. So it'd be a great time for you to transition over. And so I did, and I didn't do it unwillingly, because by that time I had fallen in love with forestry education, and I really liked the energy that, you know, all those new young students were bringing, and you're there at the very beginning of their career. And of course I was thinking, I guess, nostalgically about how, you know, my different mentors influenced me and helped, you know, set me in my direction, and I could, you know, give back and do the same. And so I worked on my PhD. I did work for INGI for 2 years, but then once I passed my comprehensive exam, and I had to really be a full-time PhD student because I had to start collecting my research data and all that. And the funding was running out with INGI. I was able to get a fellowship and transition into the last 2 years of my PhD program as a full-time PhD student. So I guess by that time you're a candidate, right? I guess that's what they call it once you get past your comprehensive exam.
Yeah.
And so it took me 4 years total. 2 of them I was working full time for the Growth and Yield Cooperative. Then the last 2 I could focus as being a full-time student.
Yeah. Cool. And what was your project while you were there?
It was part of this whole, like, looking at ecophysiological models. We were adapting the work of Steve Running had created this model called BGC for, I don't remember what BGC stands for, biogeologic climatic model or something. But basically he would grow biomes, you know, like grasslands or savannas or coniferous forests, real kind of high level, kind of broad categories, to look at just how, you know, net primary production varied between these different vegetative biomes. And so what we did is we took, you know, those kind of drivers, you know, like the photosynthesis and respiration and, you know, soils, you know, water inputs, temperatures, all these kind of things that we had to model. Yeah, one thing I came to realize is physiological models aren't parameter free. You know, it's not like, oh, you don't have to estimate all these betas in these, you know, statistical equations. Well, no, you have all these parameters that relate to, you know, respiration. Is it maintenance respiration? Is it growth respiration? You know, all these different kinds of things. There's lots of variables in a physiological model. But the idea was, how do we build growth and yield models that we can use for forest management with a change, you know, in a changing climate that would be climate sensitive? And so that was kind of the motivation behind my PhD project, because I wanted to focus in on that, and specifically 2 of the most contrasting types of climates where trees grow in Western Montana is north and south facing aspects, right? So you have less, you know, the sun intensity during the summer isn't as dramatic on the north facing slope as it is on the south facing slope. So you have totally different plant communities. You have, you know, different, you know, evapotranspiration rates, all that kind of thing. So they're, you know, having a south facing aspect and a north facing aspect is probably the 2 most dramatic differences you can get in that area. So I was looking at how net primary production was different with the forest communities and those 2 contrasting environments, as well as trying to adapt the, you know, the BGC model to, you know, being able to model that with, you know, what I would call traditional forest, inventory data. So species, diameter, DBH, total height, some measure of taper, those kinds of things. And then see if we can model it with this ecophysiological approach. And I guess the summary of that is you can do it. Some communities are harder than others, but a statistical least squares fit is going to always be better if you're trying to minimize your variance.
Right.
So you sort of traded off variability to have climatic sensitivity. But if you really wanted the most narrow confidence intervals, you'd go with an empirical, statistically based model.
Sure. I guess based on, your testing data or your fitting data, probably. I'm curious though, whenever
it was a small sample size. Yeah, and really once I got to the publication phase, needing to publish this work, I mean, basically the reviewers were saying, this is essentially a case study. You're trying to have a foot in each world here. The net primary production, where you're measuring root respiration and all this kind of stuff, which is really, really labor intensive. So it's hard to have a sample size of 600 or 6,000 or, whatever. And then the other side of it is, the large sample size of forced inventory plots. You can get a lot of those.
Right.
But it's really hard to, your sample size is important, but it's different with ecophysiological models because you do a lot of measurements of stomatal conductance, right? I mean, that's the kind of samples that, as an example, one of your measurements, that you'd have a whole bunch of those, but they wouldn't necessarily be from multiple different inventory plots. So you get into the whole pseudo replication problem and things like that. Really, the whole idea was you wanted to be able to calibrate the ecophysiological model for whatever biome you were trying to measure, not necessarily put out a lot of inventory plots to, fit a statistical model.
Yeah. I think, including climate predictors in a model is interesting. It doesn't seem to work, so well. At least it doesn't improve fits as much as you might think it does. You might get there to, for the purposes of updating an inventory to a period in time that has already been realized, like, updating your inventory to March 11, 2025. But the thing is, when you're going past that, now we're relying on projections of climate, which are not as good as our, projections of forest inventory without climate predictors. So
yeah,
it becomes very complicated to project, for example, to include climate predictors in a harvest schedule. Like, I get it for doing like sensitivity analysis. You want to run through these different climate, these RCPs and whatever, but it just doesn't seem to work that well for planning.
I know that connection that's still, I mean, that's a great opportunity for, people to contribute to the biometrics profession. That is sort of a big gap that we definitely have in our knowledge. And I know there's people working on it, but it's not low hanging fruit. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
But I mean, we certainly know that the climate is changing, and we do need to have climatic sensitivity. And investors, I know with this job, it's interesting that I had that career in academia. My early days, I went through the master's program because that's what I wanted to do in industry. I didn't need a PhD to do that. So I worked in industry for a short time. And then I had that long period as a forestry professor. And now I'm back in industry again. And so, but this time at a higher level, right? I'm not a woods worker anymore. And that's a young man's job, young woman's job, young person's job. And so now I do have a little bit more direct exposure to like investor concerns and climatic, like how does, if hurricanes increase, then how is that going to affect our investment? If the the carbon levels, CO2 levels go up above a certain amount, how is that going to affect the growth of these forests? Are we planting the right forest in the right places?
Right.
We really want to know how these things are going to affect our investments. We get those questions a lot in my business, and it I know it's a controversial subject. Some people, there's a lot of different beliefs on that, but it doesn't really matter what your beliefs are about it. When your investors are asking about it, you need to have informed answers for them.
Yeah, for sure. And, we can disagree as to why it's happening, but the facts are we have a rapidly increasing temperatures across the world. Like, that's just fact. We've been able to measure. Not to say that it's not a cycle that it hasn't been realized in the past, but it's happening now, and we need to understand what are the risks of that, what could be the benefits from that. Trees do take in CO2, and so more CO2 is potentially better for the trees. But droughts and that sort of thing are not. So being able to quantify that risk is very important whenever you have a long-term investment like forestry.
Yeah, it is.
Like yours, that is not like in this, short turnover period like a TMO or something, that y'all are more interested in the long term. Although I think BTG is a TMO, correct?
We are a TMO. It's a really interesting company, but we don't really have quick turnover though. BTG Pactual, as you mentioned earlier, is a large investment bank in Brazil, and that's mainly our only investor, right? I mean, this is like we're in their tangible assets group, and so they're in it for the long haul. So yes, we're a TMO, but we're kind of different in the sense that we don't have like a set time that we need okay, this is the end of our investment period. We're going to move on and invest these funds in a different asset. So we're going to sell all this land. We don't really work like that. So, I haven't worked for any other TMOs, so I don't really have any other perspective, but it seems like some of the others might be shorter term, or however long the life of the investment is supposed to last. And then that investor leaves the group or whatever. We don't really have that happening.
Yeah, which is an interesting place to be, because you get more of it's not just like the, buy it and flip it. It's the long term, what do we have to do to increase the productivity? What do we have to do to increase the value of the asset, essentially? And at the same time, now you have this long-term investment horizon, so you need to worry about those sorts of risks, which we were just talking about.
Exactly. And as you said, it's really difficult in the harvest planning process. And I need to be clear that I'm part of a team, like there's all these different skill sets, just like probably every organization, these are team efforts. There's no, really nobody's isolated in a silo, doing one thing.
Yeah.
But it's something that having climatic sensitivity in the harvest scheduling process, I don't really feel like, we have that nailed down probably to where it should be, but we're trying, we're trying to do it. But most, like what you said, getting back to what you said earlier, we approach it more in like a sensitivity analysis than, here's a variable in our model that represents climate.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's basically what everyone's doing at the moment. That's what we have available to us.
I think the biometrics community is pretty similar in that regard.
Yeah. And, great that, for the majority of us, we can also talk about it and share ideas. Like you said, it's not just being in a silo in a team, in an organization, but also not being in a silo as a community. We are pretty much very free with our ideas and what we're working on, if we can find some groups. But
BTG, I have to really compliment them on that, is they're not real restrictive in, what, this kind of community of sharing that you're talking about. We participate in multiple research cooperatives. We work with different forestry faculty. It's really, pretty open-minded. Now, we aren't supposed to give out data sets or specific information about our property and things the normal stuff, right? But the sharing of ideas, we kind of sort of have this idea that a rising tide benefits all the ships. So I really like that about BTG.
Well, I like that about our community in general, that we tend to be that way, more open and more, able to share those kind of things. My wife, Paula, is in chemistry, and she even mentioned that in some cases, groups in the same lab are competing against each other, and they're not sharing what they're working on in the same lab. And I'm just going that's just crazy to me. I've never experienced that anyway in our field. Which puts things in perspective when you think about it. I wanted to get us back. We kind of jumped forward a bit, but so you're finishing up your PhD. You decided at that point you wanted to be a forestry professor, and so after you finished, what happened?
So I was exactly right. I was finishing up my PhD, and especially after I successfully defended, I had to find a job. I was, my dream at that point was I wanted to be a forestry professor. So I started applying for jobs, and specifically like a forest biometrician type, not just any professor job, that I wanted. So I can't remember exactly, maybe it was 5 or 6 different schools, and I got some different interviews in different places. And the place and I got turned down too, because I wasn't in the final pool. But I think I only applied to 5 or 6 in that first year. And then West Virginia University was, gave me an interview, and so I went, and it just really clicked for me. I just really liked that place. And, I went to some other places, and, I kind of maybe didn't feel as comfortable, or for whatever reason, not because they were bad people or anything like that, or a bad program, but for some reason, West Virginia just really stood out. And so that's where I went. So in 1998, that 98 fall semester is when I started there. I met Harry Wyant. I'd heard the name Harry Wyant because he actually was one of Larry Walker's early recruits. He was the first. There was Ellis Hunt and Harry Wyant. I think Harry in silviculture, because that actually was his PhD from Yale. I think was in silviculture. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He could do a lot of different kinds of things. He was mostly a sampler. But anyways, after I guess I maybe had learned this as an undergraduate, but just sort of in passing as the history of the School of Forestry. But then I, met the man. And so even though he had retired, that's why that position was open. So that's where I realized, oh my gosh, I'm coming into Harry Wyant's position at West Virginia University, where he'd been for decades. It was really intimidating because he was, really outgoing and, was part of the whole forestry community of West Virginia. But he was so warm and welcoming. And even though he was retired, we would still, meet fairly regularly. just to talk about things. And, he helped me out and, gave me pointers and all of that. And that was also where I met my wife, Teresa. Was, we were both those were our first forestry jobs. So, that's another great thing. So I was there for 2 years, from 98 to 2000, Appalachian hardwood. So a totally different kind of forest to figure out, like I said, what I've been saying is my interests were growth models, and hardwoods, like they are, how can I describe it? They are their own individuals, right? I mean, they kind of do their own thing. They have different growth forms, and it was just, the models were much more simple because they just didn't really lend themselves to empirical modeling in a lot of different ways. So, which is probably why Harry Wyant didn't spend a lot of time making growth models at West Virginia. It was more about how do we sample our forest and have like monitoring through sampling over time. So I totally get that. And so I was there for 2 years, and then an opportunity, David Linhart retired at Stephen F. Austin. And so I had an opportunity to apply, and I got that and moved down there to start the fall 2000 semester. That's how I got back to East Texas.
Yeah.
A coast to coast trip.
Yeah. And that's a decent round trip to make over. So that would have been over what, 12, 15 years?
Yeah, something like that. I guess I left in 86 and I was back in 2000. So roughly 14 years.
Yeah.
I'm
away.
You need to have, it's kind of strange to come back home. And interestingly enough, at West Virginia, there was another former SFA professor there, Ray Hicks. He actually wrote our dendrology book, at least the one that I used. And so I got to know him, and he was on the faculty when I was there, and he taught the ecology and dendrology classes. And he and I became really good friends. He's an amazing old-time musician, and so are his son as well. But he gave me, he said, you need to, be careful. You can't ever really go back home, and I remember him giving me that advice, and it wasn't to be a downer or anything. I think he just wanted me to go in with my eyes open. There were still a few faculty that were there from when I was there, but they didn't remember me that well. So that was good. So even though I had a history at SFA from 14 years previously, it wasn't really like, I graduated and then immediately went on to the faculty. So I felt like I had a good break. I got a lot of experience in other types of forests and regions, to bring in, new fresh ideas. But I was really excited. Linhart's, his Growth and Yield Co-op, East Texas Pine Plantation Research Project. Everybody likes to say that really fast. ETPPRP. It was still underway. It was kind of floundering a little bit because there was a gap between when Linhart left and when I got there. So it was leaderless for a while. Andy Burrow, John Paul McTague were really the ones that carried it. Andy Burrow was a master's student. John Paul McTague at that time was working for Champion. Champion still existed. Wait, is that right? Yeah. So Champion was still there. I think they'd shut the mill down in Lufkin, but they still had property. But then, they were eventually sold out to International Paper and so forth. But John Paul McTague was their biometrician, and he was adjunct faculty professor for Andy Burrow, who had started with Linhart, but then Linhart had to retire. It was kind of abrupt. His wife was not in good health, so he really needed to leave to focus on her. But John Paul McTague carried Andy, and then I got on really in Andy's last semester. So those two guys, I really got to give credit for keeping that program viable while between that faculty position getting filled. So I was really excited about coming to Stephen F. Austin and building on the work that Lenhart had started back in 1982, I believe, when actually Ellis Hunt helped him start that co-op.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah, so I was there and then 2000, and then I guess I met you in the early 2000s as well. You were on the ETPPRP crew, and man, those summers, I look forward to those every year. There was field station, and then we'd go measure all of our research plots. And so that part of me that got tricked out of the woods, I at least I know it's the worst months to be in the woods in East Texas in terms of heat and humidity and ticks and chiggers and snakes and all those kind of things, but and respect the rubus and all of that. I still I loved it. I got my field work fix in the summer, collecting research data with you guys, and that was part of the SFA mission, was to involve undergraduates, forestry students, in faculty-led research.
Mm-hmm.
And so it wasn't like we were off the strategic plan or anything like that. And I think it really helped get experience. And I really feel like my those early days out of my master's program, doing all that cruising for contractors and industry and everything, I really felt like that was something I never really did. I never did a postdoc, an official postdoc. I think that might have hurt me in terms of my ability to garner research funding, to write grants. I sort of had to learn that school of hard knocks, and I wouldn't say that I ever really learned it that well.
Mm.
But I did spend my time doing field forestry, and I think that was a skill set that I was able to bring back as a faculty member and communicate to the students to help them, because in their first jobs, in their internships, because you don't start out as a high level manager as a forestry grad. You start out in the woods doing field work and all that. And so I think those are the skills that I really help try to communicate and educate the students with, so they could go out and be successful getting their first jobs, and then working their way up through whatever organization they were in.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It seems to be, these days people are more focused, at least universities seem to be more focused on the technology than the actual math and statistics behind cruising and cruise design. And so it seems like a little bit of that is just being lost with time. I really appreciate you there doing that, making sure we understood everything we needed to know about cruising, because many people in their first job, regardless of what it is, end up cruising at some point or another.
Yeah, I think it was, certainly when I started my career as an educator, it was a lot easier to teach, the formulas about where everything comes from, because the students that we were getting into our program, that's how they learn their math. Maybe they weren't proving theorems, and I never was. I do not consider myself a mathematician, even though I had my grandfather as an influence and all that. I just never really was good at proving theorems. That just wasn't one of my strengths. But the applied math part of it, I guess you could, say that, engineering is to mathematics, in that kind of a relationship that, I kind of think of as forestry is to botany, right? That, how can you apply those mathematical concepts, to forestry? So I think y'all were a lot more receptive, because, when we would do the hand calculations, because we weren't fully automated, the technology wasn't as advanced. Right. I mean, when I first started as a professor, it was a big deal whether you allowed someone to use a hand calculator on an exam, right? And it sounds like we're talking about the dark ages, but it wasn't really that long ago. Yeah. And now we're past hand calculators. Now it's, you got a data recorder, and Maybe you have to type the numbers in, but maybe the device actually Bluetooths it over.
Yeah.
And then it gets dumped into software, and then poof, you have a standing stock table with graphs.
Right.
And I did make I made my students, hand calculate those. And then when we went to the projects, I never was a good test taker. And so I remember telling Kelsey that I swear I'm going to figure out how to teach a forest measurements class without any exams. It's going to be all project. And Kelsey said, "Tell me how that works out." And I never did quite reach it. I had to have exams, but one thing that I always had in my classes was a final project. And that's where I thought it was really important to get these sophomore students out into the woods, do an inventory. It might be a really small tract, it might only be 50 acres. And that was an opportunity that we got to write some of our local, private, forestry consultants, like Azimuth Forestry, for example.
Yeah.
That they would find these different properties, and it helped them out too, because they'd get 12 or 15 groups of independent cruises, and they could compare the numbers and all of that, and sometimes they would buy us dinner or whatever, but it was just a great way to expose undergraduates early in their career to the kind of work that they might be doing as when they get out of school. Yeah. And so we worked on those different kinds of projects rather than sitting down and taking a multiple choice exam.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was based on my experience in the workforce before I became an educator. I really wanted our students to be able to compete with students for entry-level jobs anywhere in the country. That really was my competitiveness, and my goal was to make an SFA student field ready anywhere in the country.
Well, I think you did a pretty good job of it. I know there's a lot of people that are very fortunate and feel very fortunate to have had you as a mensuration and biometrics professor.
Well, y'all kept me going too. I have to admit I love the research. I love doing ETPPRP research. I really did, and still do, actually, because we're a member of that co-op, because we have a lot of property in East Texas. We have a lot of the old Temple inland footprint.
Yeah.
But seriously, it was the students was the funnest part for me as an educator at Stephen F. Austin.
Yeah. And that's what I've heard, plenty of retired professors and almost retired professors saying the same thing, that working with the students kept them young and energetic, and it was great to have those experiences, and it's basically, every 4 years is a completely, well, maybe not in forestry, maybe every 5 or 6 years is a completely new class.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought after, well, from being, your student, you were my mentor, I thought that would be the path for me also. And I realized pretty quickly when I was applying for professor jobs, including your job when you left SFA.
Yeah.
I recognized pretty quickly, though, that maybe that wasn't for me. And, then I found consulting, and this is where I, have just thrived. And this was the best fit for me. And I can tell you, because my wife is a professor, I see what she's going through in terms of, tenure and dealing with the students of today.
That's the hard stuff.
Yeah. It doesn't sound
No, it's y'all, the students and the research projects really kept me going, but there's definitely parts of, academia that I didn't like as well. But I also recognize, every day is not going to be the best. Otherwise, you can't have a best if there's some not best, right? So it's all different. I have no regrets, though. I'm glad I did it, but there were aspects of it that I didn't like as much. And I think it might be harder for me now to be a professor than when I entered that workforce, because, education funding is really getting cut a lot more and more and more. And the universities have to rely on research grants coming in. So I totally sympathize with, professors having more of a focus that may not be as applicable to applied forest management, um, because they have to bring in these research grants to, fund the institution and sponsor graduate students. And that's why I think more than ever, these research cooperatives are so important, because, industry that wants to see that we need forestry graduates that are field ready. It's a way that we can contribute to these education programs, because, these students get to work with the, and pretty, I guess you might say, just field measurement capacities, but it still gives them some experience. And maybe they have, some schools have like senior projects and stuff like that. And you get these research cooperatives, like the Forest Productivity Co-op, the at NC State, at Virginia Tech, Georgia, Stephen F. Austin, others, Florida has some too. I think these co-ops are really important to keep that energy going between academia and forest industry. So yeah. I think they're even more important. And then the faculty that are involved in these co-ops are masters at being able to bring in like the research grants that they can weave into cooperative work as well, and being able to sponsor the graduate students that do the work, and
right,
so much of the work. And it's evolving, but I think it's going to be even more important to support the research cooperatives going forward, simply because state funding is going down for public higher education.
Yeah. I think one of my concerns, now being a consulting biometrician, how things have gone in academia, basically, the more momentum you can get as a co-op, now the more, that momentum carries on into the next project and the next project. So you see kind of smaller co-ops going away. You even see it out Pacific Northwest. A lot of the growth and yield co-ops have just come under one umbrella,
Consolidation. Yeah.
Consolidation. So, but you also get, at that point, for example, University of Georgia, the PMRC, you get consolidation there. We have the Forest Modeling Co-op at Virginia Tech. And then, small ones like the ETPPRP, which you were already having, struggles with having membership and funding when you were there, they're just getting, less and less competitive against the larger groups. And not just biometrics, but genetics, everything, silviculture, everything. It's like, if we move all to one or two major universities, what happens to the programs at the other universities? What are they doing? And where are the students coming from? If they're all going to the same place, they're not getting that, the extra information they would get from not necessarily a smaller university, but a different university that doesn't have as much funding or grad students.
Yeah, I think I see your question in there. Like, what's the trend?
Yeah.
And I know it can, you can start having, thoughts of hopelessness about it. It is changing, and it is going to be different. And I think being able to adapt to it is important. If your goal is to be, I want to be a forestry professor. If that's what you want to do, then it is trickier. Like if you want a career in forest biometrics, you don't see that many professors positions advertised that way. Right. It's like quantitative ecology or, restoration ecology and things like that. And again, this is just my opinion, and maybe it's not as well as informed as it could be, but I think a lot of that is happening is because it sort of is following the research dollars because that's what they need to survive.
Right.
And I guess, the two comments I'd have about that would, or I don't know if it's two, I don't know why I said that, but a couple thoughts occur to me that, I knew about myself that I like numbers. I'm not good at proving theorems necessarily, but I like doing calculations. I remember my grandfather, this was like a really early impression in my life. I was probably only like 8 or 9 years old or 10 maybe. Can't tell you exactly, but I was in my grandparents' backyard playing in Arlington, Texas, where I grew up. My grandfather's walking around with a clipboard doing something. I'm like, "Hey, Gramps, what you doing?" He says, "I'm trying to figure out how much wood that I need to rebuild my fence." I said, "Well, how are you doing that?" He says, "Well, I'm using calculus." And I remember him showing me his clipboard. And I just remember a lot of numbers and things, but I remember the integral symbol, right? And it's amazing what imprints on a young person. But for whatever reason, that just stuck with me. You can use math to solve real world problems.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, wouldn't that have been cool if I could have found that piece of paper, as a older adult doing this kind of stuff? But that's lost to time. Who knows where that went. But anyways, the impression was lasting. So I guess, one thought is that if you develop, if you want a career, and I'm going to broaden it from forest biometrics, that if you have training in today, I guess you would call data science, you can go any direction you want to go. And I know that in our organization, we need people with quantitative data management skills. And a data science minor with a forestry major, or a data science major with a forestry minor, you can go a long way in the forest industry, and get some experience. And then John Paul McTague did it too. I mean, he had a career as an educator for a long time, and he's one of our greatest biometricians. So a long storied career in industry as well. So, as a new professor, maybe you aren't called a forest biometrician. Maybe you have to specialize in, some area, ecology, silviculture, soils, or whatever. But every discipline has a quantitative aspect to it.
Right.
And you can nurture that. And, if you get on with a university that has one of these co-ops, I believe Virginia Tech right now is hiring a silviculture professor, and they have they have the it just went out of my mind, the Harold's co-op that was there, that is Corey's.
Forest Modeling Research.
Yeah, the Forest Modeling Research Cooperative. Sorry, the FMRC. I just had a brain fart. Sorry about that. And then they had a co-directorship, with the FPC. So there's opportunities that you can get into those kind of programs as well. But if you want to be at a different university, I still think there's opportunities. Start getting involved with the forest inventory and analysis with the USDA Forest Service. That they're doing really amazing stuff, with our national forest inventory. And they aren't just commercial forests, it's everywhere with trees. So, there's a lot of quantitative data analysis work, and that, with that program as well. So I still think I'm still really optimistic that anybody with any kind of quantitative management or quantitative analytical skills is going to find a place that needs you.
Right.
Domestic timber production is still a really big deal. The South is really, the dominant region that produces the wood consumed in this country. The Pacific North, all the regions are, but we have, a huge domestic timber production industry that needs foresters. And, forestry has never been known for producing that many graduates. We don't churn out as many graduates as business and nursing and, elementary education and some of those other areas. So I really see one of the biggest differences from when I was a student. It was really hard to find a job, and you ran into a lot of, you didn't get hired because you don't have experience, but how do you get experience if you haven't been hired? And I think undergraduates now have a lot more opportunity to gain experience that can lead to, like a long-term internship and then a career path in, some company or organization.
Yeah.
I never really did work. I mean, my internships were with the Bureau of Land Management, but I never was a public lands forester. So I really can't speak to that very well. But, I do see, opportunities for a lot of these different state agencies, especially, I like Colorado a lot. So, I see a lot of those postings as well, that there are opportunities to work for, state agencies as well. But I don't have a lot of experience in that area. So I can't really speak to that very well.
Yeah.
But I think as a forester, as a forestry professor, if I were to give advice to, a young forestry professor coming in, that I think pretty much anywhere, even if you're not at one of the big consolidated university homes for these research cooperatives, FIA probably would be the first thing that I would start, looking at. And then hopefully, that there's more senior faculty in the areas where you are that can, mentor you, in terms of like research funding. I think one thing I probably would have done differently, that I would give advice to, a young starting professor, would be do a postdoc somewhere at a really well-established lab and learn how to secure research funding. Because the reality is, public education funding is going down, and your ability to bring in research dollars is going to be really important. So, build up that skill set. I think the reason I was able to skip that is because I entered that workforce at a time where, industry experience really counted for a lot, having that practical experience to be able to educate undergraduates. And I don't know if that's as important anymore. Having gone through some faculty hiring process as myself that I have in my career myself, I've just seen that kind of experience downplayed. Whereas, oh, look, this person did this grant, that grant has these publications from, their research grants. And so they would kind of like float up higher in the pool, the hiring pool. And that's just the reality of the way higher education is now. And forestry, also has one thing stacked against it. Speaking of consolidation, that a lot of these universities want to get rid of, do away with low enrollment programs. Mm-hmm. And, forestry majors aren't really known to be, abundant, right? I mean, comparatively speaking, they don't generate as much credit hours as, nursing students or business students.
Right.
So, we're going to see some consolidation as well in just the forestry schools from that aspect. Mm-hmm. Texas A&M no longer has, a forestry major. I don't know what it's called now, but they've kind of rolled it into, I think, ecology and range management. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that, the forestry companies aren't still hiring those kind of people. but it is, there is consolidation going on in that area as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's great advice. I want to try to pull us back into your story because we haven't got up.
We've kind of been divergent.
Great advice, but I wanted to pull us back a little bit. So I think at this point, we got to talk about your wonderful wife, because who basically led to the next part of your story, right?
Yeah.
She is absolutely
leaving Stephen F. Austin.
Yeah. So Teresa, it's funny, you wanted to be a rec major or you wanted to be, you wanted to guide.
Yeah.
Rec, and then you didn't do it, and then you married a absolutely brilliant rec professor. So
yeah.
But then, so you did 20 years or so at SFA, and then
15. I was there from 2000 to 2015.
Okay, you left sooner than I remembered. Yeah.
Yeah, 15, 20 at that point. What's the difference, right? Yeah, Teresa, we met at West Virginia University. She was in the recreation program there. She got her PhD in forestry from University of Minnesota. She's quite a Renaissance woman. That her master's degree was in Chinese, and her undergraduate was biology pre-med. She was a canoe guide in the Boundary Waters for 4 summers, when she was an undergraduate. And so that really instilled in her a love for the outdoors. And she tells the story, I'll tell it briefly, that, when she realized what type of life she was going to have as a Chinese literature professor somewhere, she was going to be spending a lot of time indoors in libraries looking at very old books and things. So she wanted something in the outdoors. So she switched to forestry, and it was in the recreation program. Her specialty is more like environmental communication, and she works a lot with the National Park Service. Interpretation is the field of study, experiential education. So back to Stephen F. Austin, I got the job at SFA, and Teresa followed me there. And then, so we worked there together on the faculty. And I always said she gets the next move. So yes. She had this great opportunity to come to the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and to where she is today, working her dream job. It's an endowed professorship. She still works with the National Park Service, even though she's in those types of interpretation areas, though she's in a college of education now. But it's been a really good move for her. For me, St. Louis doesn't have any forestry programs, and at that time our son was young. He was in middle school, and I didn't want to be a weekend dad. I had some opportunities to live in other cities, still doing forestry type work, whether not necessarily professor, but there were opportunities. But I would have had to live away from home and be a weekend father to my son and husband to my wife, and I just didn't really want to do that. So for me, Teresa's hit the ground running, and it's been going fast ever since. And for me, I sort of had to re-gear myself. I sort of had to repackage myself, or repurpose myself might be the way to express it. I knew I had a strong statistics and math skill set, and St. Louis has several universities and a lot of industry here, opportunity for statisticians basically. And so again, it's just amazing how these little threads happen. We were in our new neighborhood. There was a neighborhood picnic, and I met a math professor at Washington University in St. Louis that introduced me to a professor in the Division of Biostatistics, which is in the School of Medicine at WashU, who then introduced me to the director of that division. And he said, we're always looking for statistical analyst, and we actually do have a couple professorship, or, professor positions open right now. Now, immediately I figured out I didn't qualify for any of the faculty positions because all my degrees were in forestry, and I needed something in mathematics or statistics. So that's understandable. I mean, when we would hire forestry professors, we would always require at least one degree in forestry.
Right.
But I got hired on as a research statistician in Alzheimer's disease research group. And what they liked about me was my experience with longitudinal data analysis. So I basically went from longitudinal tree data to longitudinal human data. And amazingly enough, a lot of, mixed models and all of that, the statistics and SAS, I'm a SAS user. I know you're an R user, and that's a generational change too. There's less and less of us SAS users that are out there, but I was able to come in and hit the ground running, and the doctors and the scientists that I work with were very patient in educating me about, brain chemistry and all of that kind of stuff. So I had to learn the science as I went, and I learned a lot about statistics too. I don't want to say that it was exactly the same, because it was many things were similar, but many things were different. And I will say the best way to summarize this, I loved working at WashU. Even though it wasn't forestry, I worked with great people. I learned a lot about collaborative research that I'd never known before. The grants were gigantic, and that's where I kind of realized that institutional momentum, like being able to do this stuff over time, over and over and over, then these granting agencies, you build this trust and relationship, and they come back to, those programs, that really can make a difference in being able to secure funding, because all of our positions in the Division of Biostatistics, except for a few, were all on soft money, right? So all my salary was soft money. So grants were really important, but we were working with a long-established Alzheimer's disease research program, and the way they did it at WashU is the statisticians, the funding agencies required statistical plans, right? You had to do power analysis. I didn't know a lot about that. I tell you, if you're interested in statistics, first of all, there's a whole area called statistical genetics. Never knew that existed. That's just absolutely mind-boggling. And then I think the one that interested me the most, because it was the most approachable and I got to do it a lot, was power analysis. And we never really did that a lot with forestry experiments, because, we'll just, add another, 500 trees, no big deal. But when you're talking about, patients, it's a big deal, to add another 500 people. So power analysis was always part of the research process. Really neat subject area. I know I'm kind of geeking out for a little bit there, but so I really developed as a statistician. Forestry kind of, was put over here on a back burner. I stayed a member of Society of American Foresters, been a member since '84, but I stayed a member. I'm not, I wasn't involved in my state society or anything, but I wanted to keep that membership going and, read the publications, and because I love forestry, so I never really let go of that. But I pretty much, by this age that I am now, now that I'm entering my 60s, I was thinking this is where I'm going to, end my career. And I'm perfectly happy with that. I love working at WashU. Well, one of the very first foresters I met in East Texas when I first moved back in 2000 was John Locke. And he's the one that had just gone to work for BTG, and he was putting together, they just purchased the old, not all of it, but a big chunk of the old Temple footprint in East Texas. So he was putting together a team. And so there was an analyst position. It was this portfolio analyst position. I haven't really done not as much work with portfolios as I have with like inventory and growth and stuff like that. But we're a really flat organization. We wear a lot of different hats. But anyways, I got recruited back and started at BTG in July of 2022. So it was hard to leave WashU because I really liked it there, and I was local. I could come home to the same house every day. By that time, we'd gone through a pandemic, and we were having to work remotely anyways because our offices were in the hospitals, right? And we were non-medical staff, so we were kicked out. But we had to keep doing our research. So we'd become remote workers doing that. And yeah, this is good. I don't know how much detail you want me to get into here, but just for personal reasons and caring for my father who was developing dementia, I had started as a WashU employee going down to Texas to spend time with my father so he wouldn't forget who I was as a remote worker. And I could still do my work and meet my deadlines and do everything I needed to do because we had learned how to do that during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So I'm still in that situation. And in 2022, when BTG approached me to recruit me, I just flat out told him, I said, this is what I need because this is important to me, to be able to spend time with my father. My mother had already passed away from cancer, but they agreed to it because they also, right now, there's a bunch of us employees that do a lot of this information type work, analytical work, that are remote workers as well. They said it was more important for us to have the person that fits the position than, having the person be a person that maybe isn't as good a fit that can make it to the office. So I really, WashU and BTG have been so understanding about, personal needs, being able to spend time taking care of an elderly parent. And as long as you're making your deadlines and you're making your meetings and you're doing your work, everything's fine. I've never really worked for a micromanager, and I think that's something that I'm really blessed in that regard and lucky. And I know I'm not a micromanager. I mean, you were my student for a while, so hopefully I'm making a true statement. You might have a different opinion, but
no,
I don't really function well with someone breathing over my shoulder the whole time. And I'd never wanted to be that person to, someone that I've worked with, who's working with me.
Yeah.
So I kind of took us through. I don't know if you want to ask me any more about the WashU experience.
I don't want to stay on it too long, but I just wanted to say that was a little bit of a testament to the advice that you gave earlier, is that, you just with your statistical background fit right into Alzheimer's research lab. Like, I mean, you don't really hear a lot of that stories from forest biometricians, but you hear a few of them. People like you have gone to do other things outside of forestry is because we're so well rounded in our programming and everything.
Yeah, I got to give credit to all the biometrician professors that have, I've heard a lot of stories about their PhD students finding, for whatever reason, maybe that was what came available first, maybe it paid more and they had families and they needed to get, better income. Because I will say, forest biometricians probably, I can't speak for all of them. I can only really speak for myself, but I got a pay raise when I went to WashU. So, it's like, wow, really?
Yeah.
I love forestry. There's no regrets there, but I didn't realize that, forestry is on the lower end of the pay scale than some of these other professions.
Right.
But I have heard stories of, people getting their forestry education and then having a career as in the medical world somewhere as a statistician and just hitting the ground running. And I really felt like my forest biometrics background very much prepared me, for the transition. So I could focus on understanding the new science and not really, and like I said, I was learning like Cox proportional hazard models. I mean, I've read about those in graduate school, but I never used one for anything.
Right.
And that's kind of like a bread and butter of, medical research. So, and then a lot of linear mixed, the main thing we did was linear mixed models. And then of course, I know we use a lot of nonlinear mixed models in forestry research. We didn't use those so much in the Alzheimer's research simply because we didn't have as many data points, because a lot of these people, might only be measured over, 2 or 3 observations. It's really hard to establish a nonlinear trend with so few data points. It was harder to get fits and interpretable results. Your sample sizes are a lot smaller, especially when you're working with like just the brains, right? The people have passed away and they've donated their body to science and so forth. So a lot of splines. I learned a lot about splines because you would see nonlinear trends, but you really didn't have a good enough data set to fit a nonlinear model. So you would, do spline type models. And then the power analysis. I have never had to do that much. I remember my boss asked me to do one, a real simple one. It was just a 2 sample study. And I thought, oh yeah, this is easy. Okay. So I, did it the way I'd even taught, in like the old, the 517 class at Stephen F. Austin. And then I brought it in. He's like, no, he was polite, but he's laughing at me. He's like, no, that's not how we do it here. He said, read this math book. And it wasn't the whole book, but it was like this section of power analysis, and it was matrix algebra, right? And I'm like, oh, thank goodness for the University of Washington and Doug McGuire for making me take a matrix algebra class. And then we did all the matrix algebra. I remember students saying, why are we learning matrix algebra for, the 517 class? I don't remember what we had the title as, but basically intro to biostatistics for master's students, right, graduate students. And boy, am I glad that I was up on my matrix algebra, because there was a lot of stuff that I would have to program in IML, to do. But for SAS, you could also do it in R if you're an R person like yourself. Mm-hmm. But, actually doing the matrix, algebra to, come up with, here's the power of the test with, these kind of deals, set. If you have this set, your different variables that you'd have to fix to let the other one vary. And I remember asking my supervisor, who was also one of the best supervisors. I've been really lucky in my career to have wonderful supervisors. And he's probably one of the smartest statisticians I ever met in my life, and so approachable, really, really busy. He had to schedule a time. He was so good. That's why he was so busy. But he was super easy to talk to and understand. He was a really good teacher, and he was a teacher. He was on the faculty, right? So he was also an educator, and he was just really good at communicating these complex processes. But, I told him, I said, I never saw any of this in graduate school, and I see why we didn't really do power analysis that much in forestry research, because you usually were able to get really large sample sizes. But is there like a body of literature that I've missed somewhere? He said, actually, there's not that much beyond like the really simple power analysis type stuff, that when you start getting to, 2-factor studies, and then you have a random effect, and you actually have to move into a world of simulation and start doing it that way.
Wow.
And you can do it, and we did that in SAS. You could also do it in R as well. But I couldn't find this in any textbook. And Kenji Jong was my supervisor's name, the faculty member, and he had started writing a book on this type of like power analysis and medical research. But like when you get to these big clinical trials, you know, the ones you read about in the news and all that kind of stuff, there's companies that is like their specialty is power. And even WashU for the big clinical trials, maybe for some of the early stages, they would do it in-house. But when it got to like the later stages with the really big samples, they would usually hire these companies to do the power analysis, which of course they won't tell you how they do it because that's their bread and butter, right? That's their proprietary, you know, software engineering. But it's really, really complicated. And it's you know, you do it through simulation. And like I said, we did some on the smaller scale. It just really kind of opened my eyes to, you know, a bigger world of statistics. And so I grew a lot as a statistician, even though I don't have a formal statistics degree. Like you were really smart getting your master's degree in statistics while you were at Virginia Tech. Mm-hmm. And, but I never did that. You know, I was more like.
I actually didn't complete the master's degree. I took all the classes, but I didn't want to take the qualifying exams.
You know, that's interesting you said that because I was offered that opportunity at Montana, mm-hmm. and I knew what they had to do, and I was just ready to get out of school. But it was, you know, I had a lot of the classes. I would have had to taken some more, and Montana had a really neat mathematical optimization program as well at the master's level, which actually at the time interested me more than the statistics. But like you said, you saw those qualifying exams, and I was just like, ooh, man, I don't think I want to stay in school longer and get ready for that. But
I was frustrated because I think I was going, I don't think I finished all the classes that were needed for a formal master's degree. I think I was in my like third like linear modeling class, and I was just like, again, like really again. I wanted to do the fun stuff, and so I went to Harold Burkhart and I said, hey, I'm interested in the statistics, but I'm in this class where I'm again learning like linear models. I want to do the fun stuff, but they're not going to let me do the fun stuff if I stay on this track to do the master's. So he was like, yeah, okay, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to not do the master's degree in statistics, and I want to take these other courses like mixed modeling or Bayesian statistics or, you know, the really cool stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's why I did it the way that I did it. And I also,
that's too bad they couldn't like together something that was more accommodating to you and get a master's degree out of it.
So that program was interesting because it had like the master's and the PhD students all took the same classes, and then depending on your qualifying exam, depended on if you went for a master's or a PhD. But I was in classes with other people who already had master's degrees in statistics. And so they're just like acing everything because they were, you know, they were statistics majors. They already had these classes. They were great. And I'm over there, you know, struggling a bit, proving, you know, the central limit theorem or whatever, because I didn't care. Because why should I? You know, I knew I wanted to be a forest biometrician. And I, like you talked about earlier, the applied stuff was where it clicked home for me. And so, but because of the way that they had that program structured, it was like I was, you know, just going to go through the same as everybody else. And I was like, you know, I don't want to do that. Like, you know, I know plenty of people that went to do jobs based on their master's degree in statistics. So not using, actually, I mean, you can say that, but they weren't hired for their PhD in forest biometrics. They were hired because they had a master's in statistics and they loved their jobs and they great. That's not what I was going to do. Like I didn't want to do anything else. And you talked about like, yeah, you can definitely make more money as what do you call like insurance or something as an actuary. But
yeah, I forgot about that one too. Actuarial statistics.
Yeah, we can't forget Louis Jordan.
Yeah, he's unforgettable. I hope you interview him sometime.
Yeah. but yeah, and so that's why I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do the master's degree. It's like it it was better for me to do something different, and that's why everybody's program is different. And that's what Harold told me whenever I told him I don't want to get a formal master's in statistics. He's like, everybody's different. We got to figure out what's right for you.
Mm-hmm.
And he was great about that. We really miss him.
Definitely miss Harold and Jim Arney, and a lot of our great biometricians that it's you only leave this planet one way, and there's there are big vacuums that are left in the wakes of departures like that. Yeah. I'd like to jump back just a little bit back to Montana as an early graduate student there, because the forestry program they had like, the basic stats class that all the graduate students took, but I'd already had that at Montana, at Washington. And so Kelsey Milner, my major professor, he sent me over to the math department to get my stats classes and all that. And I probably spent maybe at least 50% or possibly more of my time in the math department. So I was really close to a lot of the graduate students. And there was this non-parametric statistics class that I took that the professor, he did something that was really unique, is that the assignments, there was some individual stuff that we worked out of the books and turned it in. But he had different projects throughout the class. I don't remember if there was his name was Rudy Gideon. And I think if I remember right, he'd been a minor league baseball pitcher. Maybe it was minor league basketball. I think it was baseball. But he did a lot of like sports problems, right? Like a hot hand or, a pitching streak. And is it random? Is it, a significant trend, that kind of stuff. Really a perspective I've never even seen before. But one of the things he did, to make a long story short, it was really neat, is that when we would work on projects, the classes is kind of like what you were saying. There were people there that were non-math majors, and there were people that were the math majors. And he would put us together and work on something. And maybe it's a simple 2-sample, inference test. But the way the assignment worked is you had to, first of all, derive the test from first principles. And then you had to collect the data and then do the inference test. And so there was like prove the theorem part. Like, here's the formula, say, for a Wilcoxon, rank test or something, but you had to derive it. And this is where the pairing was, because you'd be in 2-person groups. And this would be the amazing thing. The math major would do like the theory part. And then us non-math people, I had no problem applying a formula once I got it, how you collect the data and the experimental design. I was trained in that already.
Right.
And so, but I was really intimidated, and I was very unsure of myself. Was I making the right decision with this, education direction in my life? The whole inadequacy syndrome. Mm-hmm. And I remember what broke it was the math major, and I don't remember his name, that I was working with. He said, can you explain to me, how you're taking this data and doing it up with a p-value and then making a statistical conclusion? And so I showed him, and which, is bread and butter for us, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember he was silent for a moment, and I thought, and he goes, wow. And immediately I thought, okay, what mistake did I make, right? He goes, this is incredible. I have never seen anybody take data and come up with a conclusion like this.
Wow.
And right there, this light bulb turned on, because I was even too scared when he showed me how he did all his theorem stuff. I was like, wow, I don't remember what I said, but I was so intimidated. I basically didn't want to let on that I didn't have any idea what he just did, right? But when he said that and was so open and transparent and honest, then I went back to that and said, I'm just amazed at, what you were able to do. And we both had this big light bulb moment that Dr. Gideon knew exactly what he was doing by teaching collaboration between people with totally different skill sets to achieve success with a problem, right? And that's where I realized we're all built differently. And I struggle with proving theorems, but I can apply this stuff really well. And, that you realize what your strengths are that you can bring to a team, a collaborative project, and then how to put together a team that has all the right strengths to be successful. And that's why I like, collaborative work so much. And that's why we did projects in the classes you took with me, because I really wanted to teach people how to work with each other, because we all have gifts and we're all superheroes in a way, right? We all have something strong that we can contribute to the problem. We just got to put the right team together.
Right. Yeah. The interest. So I want to just wrap things up a bit. So you've talked about all of the, different jobs you've had and everywhere you've gone. And so we're looking a little bit back at, how you would have, maybe done things differently whenever you were a professor. You talked about, doing these projects and trying to get away from an exam. But I'm curious how, with your additional experience, working in basically working in the medical research, and then now coming into industry as an industry, biometrician, you're a portfolio analyst, but you're a biometrician. How might you have done things a little bit differently with the experience that that you have now? Would you still try to have gotten away with the test, gone to more of this, project related assignments, or how much you have done things differently?
I think as far as like, the quantitative skills, I don't know if I would have done things a lot differently. By the time, there's a couple thoughts here. I want to come back to the idea of timber management. That would probably be the thing that I did differently.
Yeah.
Being where I am now. And that's kind of linked to even back to Montana and maybe taking some of those optimization classes. But I didn't know it at that time. But I think it's really, I think maybe one thing I would do differently is, and the chance to do it at that time, it was called S+. But when I was at the University of Montana, I was already a skilled SAS user. And I did everything in SAS because, there was a site license at the university. So I never really had to learn a different statistical package. There were other graduate students using S+ in the math department. And of course, that evolved to R, right?
Right.
And I really wish, that may be one regret, is that, and I remember Doug McGuire giving me this advice as a master's student because we'd been using Minitab, and then he introduced me to SAS, and he said, graduate school is the best place for you to learn a programming language. You might not believe this because you're really busy, but you're going to get even busier when you get out there. So start this skill set now. And I wish I would have done that as a PhD student at Montana and learned S+, because I could have evolved into R. The whole idea of 4 next loops, the way I learned how to do it and the way you do it in R, and you've tried to help me, and you know what my mental blocks are. And I'll admit that I've never really got past. I can't really manipulate data in R. I can use the procedures once I have the, like call in the CSV file and all that, but I wouldn't call myself an R user. And the stuff, that's what we use in our company for our in-house language for our information system. And so I'm not really able to help contribute. And even when they ask me to contribute, I like have to code in a different language to, to work it out. And then we have to like, no, AI can help you with that now, but it has to get converted to R. So I wish, that's one regret. The second thing, back to timber management, I mean, my job title right now is portfolio analyst. And so we have these portfolios. And of course, I can't talk in details about those, but we have these portfolio models. And, I taught the timber management class at SFA, and we looked at like harvest scheduling and, things like that. But that's just one part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Is that you have the harvest schedule that you get your cash flows over time, but there's so much more that goes into a portfolio. And I didn't ever really know what that was until now. And knowing what I know now, I think the timber management class, yeah, we used economic, financial formulas and stuff, but seeing how all these different cash flows and, is it in perpetuity? Is it not in perpetuity? I wish I'd taken the time, I wish I'd taken the time to, maybe figure that out better. And then especially like in terms of optimization, like to optimize a portfolio. So some of those optimization classes at Montana, I think, the algorithms I would have learned and so forth would have been very helpful for that. Yeah. I think, it's really hard as a professor to be like broad, right? Your job is to kind of, specialize down into something. Mm-hmm. But if you work in industry, at least this is BTG is really my only like analyst type experience in industry, but we're such a flat organization, you have to be able to wear a lot of different hats. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm a biometrician. I help a lot with growth and yield, but also help with like timber price forecasts, which is like econometrics. And then, I help with harvest scheduling, and that's Woodstock and Stanley and, things like that. And then there's the portfolios, which is just our internal models that we've developed. And you sort of have to wear different hats to do different things. And I wish I would have learned more truly about portfolio analytics, and maybe that's more of what you learn in an MBA program. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, because I've never, taken business classes, so yeah. Especially at the graduate level. So, we had, as an undergraduate, we were required to take general business management, with like a sophomore level class, but that doesn't really, I actually have no memory of that class whatsoever, except that we all worked in groups and had a lot of fun. And, it seemed like business was more about being able to get along with other people than, at least at that level, just learning how to work with really different kind of personalities in different group settings, which was really helpful, I guess, thinking about it. But mm-hmm. that's probably, I feel like, are two areas I wish I'd learned more about along the way, because everything's so fast paced. It's really, again, back to, graduate school. I know graduate students find this hard to believe, but that's where you have the most time, right, to develop. Because when you get on the job, I constantly am asked questions, and we need to answer tomorrow in a couple of days. Yeah. But I also know that BTG also leverages my academic background, like doing research on a topic, and right, finding literature review and that kind of stuff.
Well, if the grad students are listening,
I don't know if they'll listen, but
don't get anything else out of this. You have more time now than you will ever have in the rest of your life.
And it seems to be an unbelievable statement, but it's true.
Take it from like 15 and 30 years out. Like,
yeah, exactly. And I'll admit, I was a different kind of graduate student than some. I know some people have families and, other obligations and all that. And I was, always, I never had, I wasn't married, didn't have kids. So there was a whole like slice of life that I didn't have to really worry about as a graduate student. So in that case, take that as a bias.
Yeah. Well, Dean, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your experiences, your story. And I personally really enjoyed it. I think lots of people are going to really enjoy it. So thanks again.
Well, you're welcome. Well, thanks for doing this, and I'm glad you're getting all these different interviews. It's really fun to watch them and hear what people's thoughts and reflections are and so forth. So thanks for doing all this. I'm glad to help.
Yeah, happy to do it. Well, thanks everybody for watching in or listening, and I'll see you next time.